I think we're ready to start. We've had a bit of a summer break, an extended summer break, but it's really nice to see all of you back again here. And it's great to kick off the new round of Q+ seminars with Marco Piani, who has just relocated to Strathclyde. And he's going to talk about the usefulness of entanglement in steering. So Marco, I pass over to you.
Well, thank you, Daniel. Thanks to you and Matt for organizing this, for organizing the series, and for giving me the opportunity to speak during a Hangout. So let me start by activating the sharing of my presentation. To find. So hopefully you now see the first slide of my presentation. So today I'm going to tell you about recent results obtained with John Waters about the usefulness of steering in the discrimination of physical processes. But I thought of giving a kind of overview, including also mentioning also previous results, to have a picture of entanglement and steering in the role of entanglement steering in the discrimination of physical processes. So what I'm going to try to convince you of today is that all entangled states are special, but some entangled states are more special than others. So the goals of this research program are those of understanding quantum correlations and to facilitate their exploitation. So the approach is based on an operational characterization of correlations, exactly because it is meant to facilitate the exploitation of the correlations. And in this specific case, is an operational characterization considering the usefulness of correlations in the discrimination of physical processes. So for a second, or maybe even for the whole talk, I want you to think of Mario encountering a mystery box. So as you know, there are several power-ups in mystery boxes. And for example, you may have a fire flower or an ice flower inside. And Mario wonders what's inside the box. Well, normally, he would just hit the box and obtain whatever power-up is inside. This kind of animation is a bit troublesome for representation. So let us say that we are going to consider also the standard pipes of Super Mario. So now what I want you to think of is a transformation. So the presence of the power-ups, the flowers inside the mystery box, corresponds to a potential transformation of Mario. So what we have is that Mario, in his initial state, enters the mystery box. And now, given the two possibilities, the two flowers, we can obtain a ice Super Mario or a fire Super Mario. This is the final state of Mario. So this is going to be the way we are going to look at transformation graphically, but mathematically or formally, especially with the problems of quantum mechanics. What we are going to consider are an initial state here of Mario, a transformation that in this case corresponds to one of two possible quantum channels that lead to two different final states. Okay? So these are the two options, but so let me mention that quantum channels are completely positive and trace preserving maps. Especially the trace preservation feature is going to be important in the next slide. So if we want to be inclusive of the two possibilities, and we can think of the transformation as just having two branches, each happening with a certain probability. P0 would be the probability of an ice flower being inside a mystery box. So we can think of these two transformations as two incoherent branches of the evolution. Okay, and in this case, I've represented Mario, the final state of Super Mario, in different sizes to signify different probabilities. So we can think of now these risks. So lambda 0 with a hat is supposed to be a quantum channel, a completely positive trace-preserving map. What we are doing now is rescaling it by the probability of it happening. And what we obtain is just a completely positive map that is not trace-preserving anymore. Actually, now these two maps, lambda 0 and lambda 1, without hat, to signify that we have lost the trace preservation property, constitute quantum subchannels. So they are completely positive trace non-increasing maps that nonetheless sum up to a quantum channel. So as mentioned, this mystery box with pipes attached is a quantum. We think of it as a quantum channel, lambda, that has two branches, lambda 0 and lambda 1. So notice now, generalizing this, that lambda 0 and lambda 1 need not be proportional to channels. So we can consider the case where there are two subchannels that are generic, completely positive trace non-increasing maps that sum up to a channel. And this is the notion of quantum instrument that was introduced already in the 70s. Notice that when we had the completely positive trace-preserving maps just rescaled by a probability, the probability of each subchannel, like lambda 0 and lambda 1, was a constant, independent of the state. But now when we move away from, let's say, maps that are proportional to channels, we have that the probability of each subchannel happening is state-dependent, like here. So an example of case where we have branches of an evolution where the individual branches don't form channels themselves is, for example, the amplitude damping channel. That's a very simple case where we have just one qubit. And in this case, we just think of the two Krauss operators that compose the amplitude damping channel as subchannels. Okay, one corresponding to the excitation, for example. But what is important is that it should be clear that K1, for example, in this form doesn't form a channel or even something proportional to a channel. It's just a completely positive trace non-increasing map. So in the following, we will consider instruments with many subchannels. So this is the picture that you may want to have in mind. Again, there is an initial state, there is a transformation, there is a channel, a standard channel, and that has several branches. And some correspond to sub-channels that are not proportional to channels. And this is here visualized as a Super Mario that is being cut in half. But some of these sub-channels may be standard, for example, unitaries, like in this case, just with a probability associated. So the task that we are considering is that of minimum error sub-channel discrimination. This general setting that generalizes channel discrimination. So you should think of this mystery box with pipes as a box that realizes a general transformation, a general quantum transformation, a quantum channel with several branches, so that form an instrument. And now our goal is that of determining which branch has taken place. Okay, so which lambda A. So, well, the strategy is still that of probing the channel. So we have an initial state. We input that state. That's gonna evolve, as we have seen before. And now to make our guess of what was the subchannel that took place, well, we have to measure. So here the measurement is represented as a photocamera, and formally corresponds to a general measurement that is a P of n. And we can define a joint probability distribution for the sub-channel happening and the result of the measurement, like here. And again, this should be clear that this joint probability depends on all three aspects, like the initial state, what is the instrument that we are dealing with, and what is our choice of measurement. What we want to do in this task of channel discrimination or subchannel discrimination is to maximize the probability of guessing correctly. So this probability of being correct is just the sum of the cases where here our measurement spits out the same a result that matches what was the channel that took place. So, and this is the meaning of this Kronecker delta. So this is the kind of expression that we are going to be considering, and the next steps are just that of playing with the several terms that enter: the state, the subchannels, and the measurements. So, for example, we can consider an arbitrary maximization over the measurements, defining the optimal probability of guessing for a given input. Suppose that you don't have control on the input, but you have control on the measurements, well, you may want to optimize those measurements, arriving at this quantity. A further step that would signify also better control is that of using an optimal input. So you have both optimal measurement at the output and optimal input. And what we reach is this probability of being correct that is associated just to the subchannels, so to the instrument. And here I have put an E to this stands for no entanglement. The idea being that so far we have not seen any entanglement having any role. But indeed, entanglement is possible in quantum mechanics. It can be used in the task. How does that happen? Well, so far we have dealt with the probe, this Mario, and well, he could have some help from an ancilla here, Luigi. And we will in particular focus on the case where probe and ancilla are entangled. So that means that this joint state, here I use also Alice and Bob. Alice will correspond to Luigi, and Bob will correspond to Mario. Well, this initial entangled state cannot be written as the convex combination of product states. Instead, in the case when this is possible, is stated as this decomposition, well, such a state is called separable or unentangled. Well, so how does this more general strategy for subchannel discrimination work when using entanglement, where we still use our probe to probe the channel to check which subchannel was, but we have also this ancilla that actually is just sitting there or running there. And one point is that, well, we could, if we were really to optimize over all the possibilities, well, we should plug in the best possible entangled input state of probe and ancilla, and then perform the best possible global measurement of the output probe and the ancilla. So this leads to the definition of the optimal probability for guessing the optimal input, including the possibility of using entanglement. And this just what we can do is just to use the same expression that we introduced before without entanglement, but now considering the extended system of probe and ancilla. So in this case, the ancilla does not evolve. So if you want, this is the new instrument that we want to discriminate. And if we optimize over, for example, the dimension of the ancilla, remember that this quantity here already contains an optimization over measurements and inputs, while we obtain the best possible probability of guessing correctly allowed by quantum mechanics that uses entangling inputs and global measurements. And again, here I've put a superscript E to remind you that we are using now entanglement. So what is known is that all these considerations, well, are meaningful in the sense that there are evolutions that are better distinguished by the use of entanglement. In our notation, it means that the probability of guessing correctly using entanglement for these subchannels or this instrument is strictly greater than the probability of guessing correctly without the use of entanglement. And here I'm saying there are evolutions, so one can find examples of evolutions, in this case of subchannels, where this happens. And this has been known, of course, for quite some time. In the quantum information community, probably the first to recognize it was Kitaev, who introduced the diamond distance between quantum evolutions. But this is something that is well known in the mathematical community and has been then studied extensively in quantum information. So notice that here we are using entanglement to have to improve our probability of success, and it's easy to see that classical correlations associated with unentangled states are useless. They cannot boost this probability. It's only with entanglement that we can achieve something better. So in the previous paper with John Waters, we actually turned the game a bit around, saying fix now a probe-ancilla entangled input state. Is there an instance of the subchannel discrimination problem where this state is useful? Well, it turns out that this is the case. So for every entangled state, one can find an instrument that is better discriminated by the use of that entangled state. And here I have tried to emphasize that we are really tailoring those channels or subchannels, sorry, to this specific entangled state. But still, there are such instances for every entangled state. So we can say that every entangled state is useful for subchannel discrimination. So this, you remember, this was the picture. This is our strategy when we try to discriminate the subchannels that are implicit in this mystery box. And now we said that for every entangled state, well, there is a choice of, if you want, of a mystery box that can be whose parts can be better discriminated by use of that entangled state. So we could think of this as a resource, right? So it allows us to perform better. But I want to point out that we need, in general, a global measurement. So if we thought of the initial entangled state as a resource, well, maybe also the final global measurement is a resource. It's something that is not easy to implement. So, but there is a way to boost the initial entangled state as the only resource, the only piece of the puzzle, if you want, that is, well, for example, difficult to prepare. And that's by restricting the final measurement. So in this case, we restrict the final measurement to local operations, these small cameras, local cameras, and classical communication, the phone. So once we have done this, well, the only non-local part in this scheme is the initial state. So I think considering this situation where we where we have a constraint on the final measurement, we have really elevated the initial state to the status of resource. Also, let me justify this. Since we want to prove something about the usefulness of, let's say, any entangled state, maybe even weakly entangled, well, I think it's meaningful to consider the fact that if the only kind of states that we can generate here for using subchannel discrimination, if these are weakly entangled, where maybe we should not expect, let's say, the experimentalists to be able to perform the best possible output measurement. Okay, so this is a picture that is both conceptually significant and experimentally significant. So we studied a bit the situation already, and what we found is that there are evolutions such that the advantage in the discrimination that is provided by input entanglement is preserved even with restricted measurements. On the other hand, there are evolutions such that the advantage vanishes if we impose the restrictions on the measurement. So this is was analyzed in a paper with John Waters and with Matthews. But what in this case, we focused on properties of subchannels, if you want, of these evolutions. And now what we want to investigate is the usefulness of a given state under constraints on the measurement. So remember, the first result that we have is that if we allow global measurements, every entangled state is useful. So what now if we impose constraints? So this is the situation, again, global initial state, entangled state, evolution of the probe, and then final LOCC measurement. So unfortunately, we are not able to say much about this. It could be that under general LOCC measurements, every single entangled state remains useful for the task of subchannel discrimination. The problem in analyzing this, as many experts would know, is that well, the LOCC class, the set of measurements realized by local operation classical communication, is difficult to analyze. So what we thought of doing was to simplify that class, impose further constraints. So we are going to remove communication in one direction and only consider one-way LOCC measurements. So in particular, we are going to allow the measurement of the output probe. We will, based on that measurement, we will send a classical result to the ancilla. Remember, that would be in Alice's lab, and here Alice would complete the measurement and then have a guess for the subchannel with a final measurement on the ancilla. So then, this said, let me just mention what are our main results. Well, if measurements are restricted to one-way LOCC, only steerable states can remain useful. Second, if measurements are restricted to one-way LOCC, all steerable states do remain useful. And finally, the usefulness of this initial probe-ancilla state in the situation where we use one-way LOCC measurements for the sake of subchannel discrimination, this usefulness quantifies its steerability. So I have repeated this term, steerable and steerability, a number of times, and you may be puzzled as Mario about this meaning, the meaning of this word. So let me say something more about steering. Well, the history of steering, in a sense, started with the paper by Einstein, Podolsky, and Rosen, the controversial one about the completeness of quantum mechanics. Later, Schrödinger actually introduced the term steering alongside the term entanglement, pointing out what Einstein, Podolsky, and Rosen had found in their model was a general feature. What is this general feature? Well, the idea is that if you have an entangled state, in this case you have the singlet of 2 qubits, well, Alice controls the conditional states of Bob through her choice of measurements. And this is a formula that probably it's very simple for you, but it's worth staring at. So here we have conditional states on Bob. These are not normalized states. They are normalized to the probability for their measurement and outcome to happen. So here we have a P of M element of Alice, where X here is a label for the choice of measurement. Alice will have more than one choice for the measurement. A stands instead for the outcome of that measurement. This is, as I said, is formalized as a P of M element, and by the partial trace on Alice, we get what is the conditional state of Bob. So let us move to the specific case of the singlet. For example, the first choice of measurement, the first P of M Alice may choose is the standard one in the computational basis 0, 1. That leads to 2 possible conditional states on Bob. Again, 1 and 0. You may know that when you consider the singlet, the results of measurements in the same basis are opposite. So when Alice measures 0, Bob will the state of Bob will be exactly 1, with a constant in front that is the probability of that outcome to happen. So again, these conditional states are normalized to the probability of the outcome of the result of the measurement of Alice. Another choice of Alice for the measurement could be that of measuring the plus-minus basis, and this will lead to a very different, if you want, conditional states on Bob's side. So these two sets are ensembles for the reduced state of Bob that, as you know, for the case of the singlet, is the maximally mixed state. And the point is that Alice can realize very different ensembles thanks to the entanglement that exists between her and Bob. In the next slides, we will consider collections of ensembles because we want to check exactly how many or how different are the ensembles that Alice can induce on Bob's side. And so let me introduce this notion of assemblage that is just, as I said, a collection of ensembles for the same reduced state of Bob. So now I mentioned this historical perspective on steering, but the study of steering was revamped by a famous paper by Wiseman, Jones, and Doherty in 2007, where they consider steering from the perspective, if you want, of from the modern perspective of quantum information, and from the point of view of entanglement verification. And here, let me present it as entanglement verification by local measurements. So let's say that we have perfect control on local measurements. So these are known, and that means, mathematically speaking, we know what are the exact POVMs that we are realizing. Then, if you can do enough of these POVMs, you can do local tomography. And as you know, this means that you can do also global tomography. So in principle, separability problem aside, every entangled state can be detected. So this is the situation. We have our global state, and we are going to perform local measurements. Of course, there are several possible, so there is a choice of measurement, both for Alice and for Bob, and each with providing different outcomes. But the point here is that these measurements are known. And as I said, this allows the full reconstruction of what was the initial state, a potentially entangled state. So from this perspective of checking what is the shared state, the standard Bell non-locality, assuming quantum mechanics, can be thought as device-independent verification of entanglement. What do I mean by that? Well, by device-independent, it means that in this case, neither Alice nor Bob have real control on their measurements, or if you want, they don't really trust them. What they can do, definitely, is choose the measurement and obtain an outcome for that measurement, but they don't really know how that measurement is implemented. If you want, they don't know what is the exact mathematical description in terms of POVMs. So in this case, entanglement can still be certified using exactly Bell non-locality. And it can be certified just based on, not on the reconstruction of the full state, but just on the joint conditional probability that relates the choice of inputs and the outcomes, the choice of input or choice of measurements and the outcome of the measurement. Einstein, Podolsky, Rosen steering, then in this modern quantum information view, corresponds to semi-device independent entanglement verification. So in this case, we have, let us say, Alice that Bob that trusts is measurement. So this is using a known measurement device where you can choose the measurement, obtain the outcome of the measurement, but particularly he knows what is measured. while we still have this black box scenario for Alice. Since in this case Bob has full quantum control of his measurement, well, the point is that he can do local tomography. So we have this picture where Alice, with her unknown measurement devices, well, can choose a measurement and obtain an outcome, and correspondingly, we have access to the information about the conditional states realized on Bob's side. And again, these are not normalized states, but they are, let's say, they are normalized in the sense of the trace to the probability of the outcome A for measurement, choice of measurement X on Alice's side. So in the same way that Bell locality allows certification of entanglement in a full device independent way based only on conditional probabilities, steering allows the certification of entanglement looking only at the assemblage. So it means this collection of various ensembles for Bob's reduced state. One ensemble per choice of measurement. That means per value of X. So now we have this classification where of states. For example, we say that a shared state is non-local if it is entangled enough that its entanglement can be revealed in a device-independent way. On the other way, we can say that a state is steerable if it is entangled enough that its entanglement can be revealed in a semi-device-independent way. So you have potentially this complicated picture that I'm going to show you. So we have the set of all states. Often people in quantum information only care between the distinction about the distinction between unentangled states and the rest of states. That means entangled states. One can introduce the notion of local states that admit the verification of their entanglement. Of non-local states that admit their verification of entanglement by violation of some Bell inequality. So in this case, we can have now, interestingly, states that are entangled but that don't allow device-independent verification of their entanglement. So we say that they are local, and others that instead are non-local. Steering adds one more layer where we can have states that are local, but they allow for a semi-device independent verification of their entanglement. And some others that instead don't, at least when Alice is the one that measures. And indeed, steering is, as you can imagine, inherently a directional feature. So for a given state, we have to consider the steering of both Alice and Bob, and the state may have different features in the sense of the possibility of verifying entanglement depending on who we consider as the steerer. So this, of course, is a complicated Venn diagram. I don't want to be worried too much about that. We are going to focus on something simple as this. We are going to consider the steerability by Alice. And again, all unentangled states are obviously unsteerable by Alice, but there are some others that are entangled and still unsteerable. So we want to prove that all the states that are steerable by Alice are actually useful in subchannel discrimination. And all the states that are here, unsteerable by Alice, instead are useless. So this was our picture, initial state, subchannels to be discriminated, and one-way LOCC measurements. What does it mean to have one-way LOCC measurements? Well, formally, it means that Bob here performs a measurement that means just one P of M with several potential outputs, results, X. The result of the measurement is sent to Alice, and now Alice gets to choose which measurement to apply based on the outcome of Bob. So overall, this procedure corresponds to a one-way LOCC measurement. That means a one-way P of M realizing this measurement, again with a label B that indicates our guess for the subchannel. So, and the point now that we are, the quest that is that of deciding whether there are situations where when we optimize over these one-way measurements, one-way LOCC measurements, we can have a performance, an ability to discriminate the subchannels that is larger than in the case where we don't have initial entanglement. And the key, probably you might have noticed, is that in this scheme we end up with something that reminds us of steering. Okay, so Alice here, the ancilla, is exactly in the situation considered by steering, where there is a choice of several measurements, each with distinguished outcomes. So a first observation that is quite direct is that if the state is unsteerable, by definition, for any choice of these potential measurements on Alice, the assemblage given by all the conditional states on Bob could also be obtained from a separable state. Right? So that's the notion of steerability. If the state is unsteerable, it means that we cannot verify its entanglement in the sense that there is always an explanation in terms of a separable state. So, and as I mentioned, when we deal with initial input separable states, in this case it's effective because it's due to the measurement on Alice. Well, anyway, the fact is that it's going to be useless for the sake of improving subchannel discrimination. So we arrive at the fact that only steerable states can be useful under the assumption that measurements, or the restriction that measurements are done by one-way LOCC. And notice that this applies also to entangled states as long as they are unsteerable. So again, with global measurements, all entangled states are useful for subchannel discrimination, but when we impose the constraint, then some of the entangled states, if you want, are not entangled enough to be useful. And the most difficult part is that of proving that all steerable states stay useful. So here comes the math that supports that statement. Is just a sketch, so don't be scared. If the state is steerable, consider any steerable assemblage that can be obtained from it. Okay, so if the state is steerable, by definition, there is a choice of measurements by the steerer such that the conditional state can verify entanglement. We know that they can only come from an entangled state. So for such a steerable assemblage, we can consider the robustness, its robustness of steering. Here you have a definition. Let me read it out for you. So this is the assemblage, this rho AX. Well, what we are going to do is to mix it with another assemblage, and we are going to consider a mixing of this, the minimum mixing, the minimum addition of this kind of noise, so that the resulting assemblage is unsteerable. That means with the resulting noisy assemblage, we will not be able anymore to conclude that the original underlying state was entangled. So the formulas might be hard to digest, but let me use then this figure. So now we are considering here the assemblage space. Okay, so we are considering all assemblages in principle. That means all these collections of ensembles. What we have here then is our assemblage of interest, and what we do is to mix it like in a convex combination with an arbitrary assemblage. And what we want is that the mixing is strong enough, but just enough to bring the resulting assemblage within the set of unsteerable assemblages. And we are going to use then this minimum noise, the minimum value of t here, to quantify the degree of steerability of rho. So what we find is that computing this steering robustness for the assemblage rho AX corresponds to a semi-definite programming optimization problem. You may be familiar with semi-definite programming. If not, I encourage you to become familiar, because it has proven to be a wonderful tool in the context of quantum information. And the idea is that the semi-definite constraint, let's say the fact that we refer to matrices that are positive semi-definite, is naturally appears in quantum information contexts just because, for example, quantum states are positive semi-definite density matrices. So in this case, our optimization problem looks like this. We want to maximize some function where you have a combination of that, of course, uses our target assemblage, and some free variables, f, a, x. I'm going to show you in the next slide that maybe you may want to think of these as some inner product in assemblage space. Well, we want to maximize this function, but with under some constraints on these f's. In particular, there are these two constraints. One is easy to read, and it is that these f's are positive semi-definite, hence the idea that this is semi-definite programming. But there is another one that is less trivial, and I won't read it out for you. So these coefficients, so this d here these are some coefficients, and that actually are given by a deterministic response function, and this lambda here is an identifier of the deterministic response function. So I'm going to try to argue in the next slide or two where this comes from, but the idea is that this part bounds the value that we can achieve for this combination in the case of unsteerable assemblages. So as I said, if you think of assemblage space, here is our target assemblage. Well, you may probably think of this choice of variables f's as defining hyperplanes, and I use this image just because it's very reminiscent of what we do in entanglement theory, where we have now again the state space. We have some entangled state that is outside a set of separable states, and we use entanglement witnesses that again are like witnesses, like hyperplanes in the state space. Well, I think that this f is you could think of it in those terms. So it's an hyperplane. So, and to explain where the deterministic response functions come from, well, let me consider what happens when we measure a separable state. So again, here is a separable state shared by Alice and Bob, and we have various measurements performed by Alice leading to conditional states on Bob that, by definition, since this is separable, are going to be unsteerable. Well, forget if you want the steps here, but the point is that as soon as you consider this, you end up with this kind of decomposition for unsteerable assemblages. So you can think of each element of the assemblage as being the let's say the linear combination of some hidden states, where now the coefficients of this combination are just formed by deterministic response functions. Okay, so, and this is the source of the deterministic response functions in our semi-definite program. So now what we do is we use the SDP optimization problem to construct our subchannel. So remember, we have we started with some state that we assume to be steerable. We perform some, Alice performs some measurements, and as a result, we have a steerable assemblage. Well, we can now run the STP optimization program that tells us that there are certain Fs with certain properties. Well, those Fs are used now to construct suitable subchannels that are better distinguished by the use of that state. And I don't want to enter here into the details, but you can refer to the paper. But the idea is simply that, so we want to define these subchannels, and we just assume a certain construction here. There, I'm not providing all the details, but for example, I can mention that we do that by defining the duals of these subchannels in a relatively straightforward way, and you can see that we do use the Fs in this assignment that defines the channels. So let me mention that, interestingly enough, maybe these subchannels that we construct have a classical output, so they are really measurements. So you should trust me that through such a construction, we prove a result like this. So let us read together this formula. So on the left, we have a ratio between the probability of correctly identifying the subchannel that took place among the subchannels that form this instrument. And this is a probability that is achieved by the given input state by means of the best possible one-way LOCC measurement of the output. This is compared, in the sense that we take the ratio, to the best success probability when we don't use entanglement for the same instrument. Okay, so now what you do, you consider all possible games, or let's say all possible instances of instruments, I mean choices of subchannels, and you take the supremum of this ratio. Well, what we prove is that this is equal to 1, that is the trivial part, plus the robustness of steering of the state rho AB. So it means, so let me state again that if you disregard this +1, the probability of success in discriminating the subchannels using this input state rho AD and one-way LOCC measurement is the robustness of steering of the state fold the probability that you can obtain without entanglement. And actually, this can be pretty big. So, but I have still to define this, but you may imagine that is just something that we can build upon the robustness for assemblages that was defined. Right? So this was the robustness that we saw in the figure, is the noise that the assemblage is able to tolerate before becoming unsteerable. And now, well, these assemblages are generated by different choices of measurements for ALICE, and again we consider the supremum over these all these measurements. And this leads to a parameter of steerability for the state itself. And notice that is from ALICE to bulk. So one remark is that that I want to make is that our semi-definite programming approach was also inspired by a recent work by Skripchik, Navasquez, and Cavalcanti, and they also, instead of looking at the robustness, they look at another concept to quantify steerability, that is the steering weight. I can comment later on this during question time. But let's say that the two approaches share some tools, and they have somewhat a similar spirit, but they focus on different properties of steerability of assemblages. So let me move to the conclusions. I hope I've convinced you that all entangled states are special. Maybe you were already of this opinion for other reasons, but here what I told you is that all entangled states are useful for subchannel discrimination. And these, we know this for sure in the case where global measurements are allowed at the output. Later, I proved or argued that some entangled states are more special than others. And by some, I mean the steerable ones. Indeed, only steerable states can be and stay useful for subchannel discrimination under the, I'd say, physically relevant and conceptually meaningful constraint that the measurements are performed by one-way LOCC. Also, we introduced the robustness of steering. There have been many works already about steering, but actually not so many quantifiers of steering have been introduced. We are quite proud of this robustness of steering, and the idea and the reason is that it has many interesting features. Well, to start, as I explained, this robustness of steering has at least two operational interpretations. One is the resilience of steering to noise, and hence the name robustness, but also we prove that it corresponds to the advantage provided by tanks that is due to steering in subchannel discrimination. As a second point, it's efficiently computable because semi-definite programming is efficient, at least numerically, for a given assemblage. That means, suppose that you have this entangled state in your lab and you perform measurements to prove that it's a steerable state. Well, now, if you perform tomography, you will end up with an assemblage, and given the description of that assemblage, this robustness of steering can be computed quite easily. Notice also that the robustness of steering provides a semi-device independent bound to the robustness of entanglement. So I've not spoken about this, but given the geometry of the sets, or the shape of the sets that we have seen in this presentation, you can imagine that there is a notion of robustness of entanglement that actually inspired the robustness of steering. And the idea is that here that I want to point out is that the robustness of steering provides a lower bound to the robustness of entanglement. That itself is a very meaningful quantity with operational interpretations. Also, and this is a comment that refers in particular to the steerability steering weight that happens to be, for example, maximal for every pure state independently of the dimension of your pure state. So a pure state of 2 qubits, however entangled, or a pure state of qubits for d, the dimension d, whatever number, as long as there is entanglement present, according to the steering weight, those states would be equally and maximally steerable. Well, in our case, these two situations, both in dimensionality and in degree of entanglement, are distinguished by the robustness of steering. And also, there are recent results, like by Gallego and Aulita, on creating a resource theory for steering. And well, I'm happy that they found that our robustness of steering is a sensible quantifier when we look at steering as a resource. So some open questions. Well, at the moment, I don't know whether to judge this embarrassing, but we don't have a closed formula for the robustness of steering for pure states or maximally entangled states. I told you that in the case of the steerable weight, well, this would be, it was proven to be 1 in all these cases. Here, well, we expect to see a difference depending on the degree of entanglement, but we don't have a closed formula. What we were able to prove in the paper is that it was just that by considering maximum entangled states, the degree of steering grows with the dimension. So, what we did in all this talk was to consider the general problem of subchannel discrimination, where every single branch of the evolution is a completely positive but not necessarily trace-preserving map. And still, it would be interesting to know whether, so we found that in this general scenario we can fully characterize steering it would be interesting to know whether we can go back to a more specific problem of channel discrimination, where every branch is just proportional to a channel. And finally, one last open question is whether we focus on the one-way LOCC because it's difficult to treat general LOCC, but it would be, of course, still interesting to know whether under general LOCC, all entangled states stay useful, and it's not only that steerable states are useful for subchannel discrimination. Okay, with this, I conclude my talk. I would like to thank you, and I'm ready to answer your question. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Marco. So let me say that if you're watching this on the live stream and you have any questions, please type them on the live stream. We will monitor this and come back to you and bring this question in. You are also welcome to join the Hangout. We still have one slot left, so you can ask your question live. And for those of you who are actually in the Hangout, if you could indicate to me on the chat if you have questions. And I think Matt had a question, so I'll start with you. Oh, Matt, maybe I misunderstood. Matt, you don't have a question? No, he's shaking his head. Okay, so then I have a question. I must admit I didn't really understand questions. Please type them on the live stream. We will monitor this and come back to and bring this question in. You are also welcome to join the Hangout. We still have one slot left. So sorry, I'm trying to mute. Okay, excellent. I'm trying to mute someone. So I didn't really understand the distinction between subchannel discrimination and channel discrimination, and I know that's a little bit embarrassing. But why can't we just normalize the subchannels and then it's a channel discrimination problem again?
Okay, so let us see now. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. So the difference is the following. Maybe you should you can think of the concrete case of the amplitude damping channel, where you have this. Even if you consider the global channel, you have just two Krauss operators, and each Krauss operator is you can then, by using that Krauss operator, you can define a subchannel, right? So a transformation, for example, one Krauss operator corresponds to, well, there was this day excitation. Well, that channel is not proportional to a trace-preserving channel. So the probability for that event to take place is not a constant. It really depends on the input. So you cannot just factorize out a constant and make it trace-preserving. So, so in the situation with subchannel discrimination is likely different. It generalizes channel discrimination, but is likely different in spirit from channel discrimination. So when you consider channel discrimination, you can imagine that there is someone who has set that put in this box one among many possible channels with a certain probability distribution. And you want just to guess what this guy actually did. For subchannel discrimination, when we allow for subchannels that are not, let's say, trace rescaling, well, in that case, it's as if there was a box, like a physical process, and information about which subchannel took place definitely may leak out. So in principle, that information is available to someone, and you want, looking at the output, also to guess that information. So if you want, there is a kind of the information flow, the classical information flow is, I don't know whether to say reverse, but maybe, yeah, that's, if you want to put it at the extreme to make it more clear, it's reversed. So in channel discrimination, someone plugs in information about which channels should be applied, and you have to guess that. In the general subchannel discrimination, that information leaks out of your mystery box to someone, and you want also to have access to that information. Does it make?
Yeah, thanks. I pass on to Gerardo.
Hello? Yes, one question. Now, can you keep changing the settings so that you also recover non-locality? So, okay, you say I do just measurements without communication, and the same subchannel discrimination problem, what do I get?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's something that I've been thinking about, and it's actually, I'd say, almost the next natural step. So in my mind, what I'm trying to do is to have a classification of the different quantumness of correlations in an operational scenario that deals with channel discrimination. And at the moment, I'm not sure exactly how. So what we have done now has been to capture entanglement. So if you want the border between entanglement and entangled states and unentangled states is captured. It was the result from 2009 with John. Now with this subchannel discrimination, we have captured the border, or located the border between steerable and unsteerable states. And it would be great to have some scenario that still deals with channel discrimination, where you locate the border between locality and non-locality of quantum states. So I tried a few things. It's not fully clear. The idea is that if you have just local measurements without communication, so remember in this case we have one-way LOCC, that makes the use of the communication is essential, because if you don't use communication, you have only local measurements. In a sense, you are realizing ensembles on the, you're realizing, if you want, ensembles on the other side, and then it's hard to imagine that you can perform better than with the best input state in the scenario where you don't use entanglement. So, so the idea is that I'm not sure how you should. Now you have three elements, as I hope it was clear. You have the input state, the channels or subchannels, and you have the measurement. And now it's a matter of deciding, if you want, or discovering whether it's enough to keep tweaking the measurements, maybe somewhat reducing still more their power, their generality. So we move from general measurements to one-way LOCC measurements. One could find some other restriction, or it could be that to capture non-locality, you have to also restrict the kind of channels that you want to discriminate. So you have, I think that is good to keep in mind that there is also that, let's say, degree of freedom to play with.
Okay, so one way, well, you could do it artificially, trying to reduce the communication until you find just non-locality, but then you have to justify it if it's possible. Now, another question is the following. On pure states, can you see whether this is, you say you don't have a formula, but is it equal to the, can you show if it's equal to the robustness of entanglement?
Well, I don't know that. I must admit that I have not worked a whole lot on that. I have a student now just working on the quantification of pure states. We will embark maybe in this kind of trying to find these relations. I don't think that is necessarily going to be just the standard coincide with the robustness of entanglement. I think it's just a lower bound to that, and it might be something more complicated for the case of steering. I must say that I don't have any good guess at the moment. I wouldn't be able to share any good idea.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
I don't see any other requests for questions in the chat, but I think Jan said that he might have one. Jan, if you have one, please raise your arm.
Actually, we don't have a question. We just wanted to join later.
Okay. So is there anyone else who has questions?
Anyone questions?
If that's not the case, I can't see any on the live stream either. So thanks very much, Marco, for this nice talk. Yes, just 1 second before Matt wants to ask something. Okay, Matt, go ahead. Sorry. Yeah.
It's just that there's a question on the live stream I was pointing out. There's a question on the live stream.
Okay, can you read it?
So it's from Ishtant, and it says that you mentioned that steerability can be viewed as a resource. Can you elaborate on this a little? Is the robustness of steering a monotone under some type of operations?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So I mentioned towards the end in my conclusions that there are recent, well, at least one recent work about the development of a resource theory for steering by Gallego and Aulita, and they find that what we have introduced, this robustness of steering, is a good quantifier from this resource perspective. It means that what they do is to find reasonable classes of operations under which steering should not increase, and under the class that they find, that argue is a good class of operations, well, our quantifier about this robustness of steering does not increase. So they can prove that.
Okay, guys, thanks very much. I want to make one small announcement, which is that we now have a mailing list where we announce the talks, because we find that the stream on Google Plus is not always reliable in communicating new talks. So if you want to join us, let us know. If you do have some feedback, or you want to suggest speakers, or you want to talk about anything else, please stay on and discuss. And thank you.